The security guard's hands trembled as he removed his badge for the last time, placing it on the marble counter like a man surrendering a piece of his own heart. 12 years. 12 years of showing up before sunrise, of memorizing every regular customer's name, of standing quietly at his post while people who made 10 times his salary walked past without a glance. And it had all ended over a single $5 bill that wasn't even missing anymore. If you believe people deserve a second chance, and that quiet dignity should never go unnoticed, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Share this video with someone who needs a little hope today. And subscribe to Kindness Corner so you never miss a story like this one. His name was Daniel Reyes, and until that morning, he had been the senior security officer at Meridian Trust Bank, one of the most respected private banking institutions in the city. He was 41 years old, a widower, and the sole parent of an 8-year-old girl named Sophie, who believed her father could fix anything: broken toys, skinned knees, even the ache of missing her mother, who had passed 3 years earlier after a long illness. Daniel had built his entire life around two things: protecting the people who walked through those glass doors every day, and making sure Sophie never felt the absence of a mother more than she had to. He packed her lunches himself, braided her hair before school, with hands more accustomed to holding a radio than a hairbrush, and worked every double shift he could find to keep a roof over their heads in a city where rent seemed to rise faster than his paycheck ever could. That morning had begun like any other. Daniel arrived at 6:15, nodded to the overnight janitor, and took his position near the entrance as the bank prepared to open. At exactly 9:02, Vanessa Cole walked in, the newly appointed regional branch director, a woman in her late 30s whose crisp white blazer and clipped heels seemed to announce her presence before she ever said a word. She was ambitious in the way people become when they've spent years being underestimated and have decided never to be underestimated again. Her promotion 3 months earlier had come with enormous pressure from corporate to cut costs and tighten operational discipline, a phrase she repeated so often that the staff had started saying it under their breath like a private joke. What Vanessa didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was that Daniel had, 2 days earlier, found a $5 bill on the floor near the ATM vestibule. Rather than pocket it, he had done exactly what he'd done for 12 years with every lost item, every dropped receipt, every forgotten umbrella. He logged it, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in the lost and found box behind the teller counter, exactly where protocol required. It should have ended there. But a new intern, eager to prove her diligence to Vanessa, had noticed the envelope during a routine audit, and not recognizing the standard lost and found procedure, flagged it as an unaccounted cash discrepancy. Vanessa, desperate to show corporate she ran a tight operation, didn't ask question. She didn't check the logbook sitting 3 feet away with Daniel's neat handwriting, confirming exactly what had happened. She simply summoned him to her office, and in front of 2 junior staff members, told him that a bank could not employ someone it couldn't trust with money, however small the amount. $5, she said, was never really about $5. It was about integrity. And then she asked security, the very department Daniel had led for over a decade, to escort him out. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or beg for his job the way some might have. He simply asked if he could say goodbye to the tellers he'd worked beside for years. And when Vanessa refused even that small mercy, he nodded once, picked up the framed photo of his late wife and daughter from his desk, and walked out into the morning light carrying a coffee mug, and the quiet devastation of a man who had just lost the only stability he had left. He sat in his car outside the building for almost 20 minutes before he could bring himself to drive home, rehearsing in his mind how he would explain to an 8-year-old girl why her father no longer had a job, and wondering, not for the first time, whether the world simply had no room left for people who tried to do everything right. What Daniel didn't know, what he had never told a single soul at Meridian Trust in 12 years of quiet, dutiful service, was that his modest uniform and unassuming demeanor hid an extraordinary truth. Long before he ever became a security guard, Daniel had spent a decade as a structural engineer, holding several patents related to earthquake-resistant building materials that had, almost by accident, become essential to a booming wave of infrastructure development across 3 continents. After his wife's diagnosis, he had stepped away from that world entirely, selling the rights to his patents to a private consortium in exchange for a lump sum, and more importantly, the freedom to be home every night with his daughter and his dying wife. He had taken the security job not because he needed the income to survive, but because he needed structure, purpose, and a way to stay close to people during the loneliest years of his life. The money from those patents had sat quietly in an account at, of all places, Meridian Trust Bank, nearly $90 million, untouched, unnoticed, and completely unknown to anyone in that branch except the handful of executives at the bank's central office, who managed high-net-worth accounts under strict confidentiality. For years, Daniel had kept that fortune separate from his daily life on purpose. He didn't want Sophie growing up surrounded by excess, and he didn't want his colleagues treating him differently once they learned who he really was. He wanted to be known for showing up, for holding doors open, for remembering birthdays, not for a number in a bank ledger. But sitting in his car that morning, humiliated in front of people he had protected for over a decade, something in him shifted. It wasn't anger exactly. It was clarity. He picked up his phone and called his private banking advisor, a man named Marcus Chen, who had managed Daniel's account with quiet professionalism for nearly 8 years. Daniel asked him to begin the process of withdrawing the full balance of his account and transferring it to a competing institution across town. Effective immediately, the ripple effects began within hours. A withdrawal of that magnitude from a single regional branch triggered immediate alerts at Meridian Trust's corporate headquarters. And by early afternoon, senior executives were on emergency calls, trying to understand how a $90 million relationship, one of the largest private accounts in the bank's entire regional portfolio, had been managed for years without branch leadership, even knowing it existed, and how that same branch had, that very morning, humiliated and fired the account holder over a $5 misunderstanding that a simple glance at the logbook would have resolved in 30 seconds. Vanessa was called into an emergency meeting before she had even finished her lunch. She sat across from 2 regional vice presidents, who did not raise their voices. Did not need to, because the numbers on the screen in front of them said everything that needed to be said. She tried to explain that she hadn't known, that the intern's report had seemed clear-cut, that she had simply been trying to enforce standards corporate itself had been demanding for months. But the deeper truth, one she couldn't escape even as she said the words out loud, was that she had never bothered to ask a single question before ending a man's career. She had seen a uniform and a modest paycheck, and made assumptions about what kind of person stood inside them. By the end of the week, Vanessa Cole had been quietly removed from her position. Her name circulated among industry contacts not for her ambition, but for the story that would follow her for years: the branch director who fired the wrong man over $5 and lost the bank its largest client in the process. But this story was never really about Vanessa's downfall. It was about what Daniel chose to do next. When Meridian Trust's regional president personally called to apologize and beg him to reconsider, offering not just his old job back but a senior advisory position, and a public apology to be issued company-wide, Daniel listened politely and then declined every part of it except one request. He asked that the 2 junior tellers who had stayed silent that morning, afraid to speak up against their new director, be given the chance to keep their jobs without any mark against them, since they had only been following the chain of command in a system that had failed all 3 of them. The bank agreed. Daniel then did something that no one, not even Marcus Chen, fully expected. Instead of simply moving his fortune elsewhere and walking away, he used a portion of it, a little over $2 million, to establish a scholarship and emergency assistance fund for single parents working in service and hospitality roles across the city. Industries where a person could work with total dedication for over a decade and still be one bad day away from losing everything. He named it simply the Sophie Fund, after his daughter, and insisted that recipients never be required to explain or justify their hardship, because he remembered exactly how it felt to have his own integrity questioned, without anyone bothering to check the facts first. Word of what happened spread quickly through the city. Not because Daniel sought attention, but because Marcus Chen, moved by what he'd witnessed, shared the story with a local reporter who saw in it something the whole city needed to hear. Within weeks, Daniel found himself being recognized on the street, not as a disgraced former security guard, but as a man who had turned public humiliation into private generosity without ever raising his voice or seeking revenge. He was invited to speak, quietly and briefly, at a community event honoring service workers, and though public speaking had never come naturally to him, He stood at that podium with Sophie, sitting in the front row, and told the crowd that the hardest year of his life had taught him something he hoped they would carry with them. That dignity has nothing to do with your paycheck, and that the way you treat someone who seems to have nothing tells the truth about who you really are. Especially when you're wrong about how much they actually have. If this story moved something in you today, if it reminded you that kindness always finds its way back around, and that the quietest people often carry the deepest strength, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who could use a little hope this week. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Daniel's. And before you go, we have one small request in the comments below. Simply type the word dignity if you believe every person deserves to be treated with respect, no matter what job they hold or what they seem to have. We read every single one, and it means more than you know. Daniel never went back to work at a bank again. Instead, he spent his mornings walking Sophie to school himself. No longer rushing to a shift, no longer watching the clock for someone else's schedule. He kept the mug. He kept the framed photo on a new desk in a small home office, where he now managed the Sophie Fund full-time, reviewing applications from people who reminded him every single day of the man he used to be, quietly doing the right thing, and trusting that eventually someone would notice.